Hi, everyone. Welcome to Module 8, where we're going to talk about cults and how law enforcement catches some serial killers. Before we get into that, though, let's take a brief look at what we covered in Module 7. So, in Module 7, we talked about how serial killers are made, and we also talked about power and control playing a role in serial killings. You had two chapters to read, chapters 9 and chapters 10. You also had an article to read on Harold Shipman. Probably one of the more prolific serial killers that nobody's ever heard of simply because of the number of people he killed. Remember, he was a doctor that killed some of his patients. You also had 3 or 4 videos to watch. You had 3 videos to watch and a podcast that was also on YouTube that you needed to watch. Those also helped in your assignment for this week, which you needed to watch one of those at least to complete the assignment for this week, which was the short writing assignment on interviews. And then you also had your Module 7 discussion questions. As mentioned in other videos, those assignments are now considered late. So if you haven't turned those in and you still want to get some credit, please make sure you submit those as soon as possible. Again, no assignment can be received after 5 days late. So that is Module 7. Let's take a look at Module 8. Module 8, we're going to review how cults play a role in some serial killers, and we're also going to learn how law enforcement catches serial killers. Our learning outcomes for this week are the motivations involved in multiple murders. Again, we're going to talk about theories of causation, some of the characteristics of the offenders, and list and examine the problems associated with investigating, apprehending, prosecuting, and punishing serial killers. Your readings for this week are chapters 11 and chapters 12. So let's get into that. Chapters 11 is 9 pages, pages 143 to 154. And chapters 12 is a little bit longer, and it's 15 pages from pages 155 to 170. So let's talk about chapter 11, Killing Cults. Chapter 11 starts off talking about killings that took place on the border of the Mexico-United States border. It's in Mexico, just south of the Texas border, about 20 miles. The individuals that committed the crimes were an individual by the name of Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo. He was a native of Cuba, and his loyal followers called him the charismatic El Padrino, the Godfather, because of his spellbinding influence over devotees. He allegedly was able to convince his followers that their drug activities could never be touched by law enforcement as long as they obeyed his commands, and among them to kill for survival. The followers of Constanzo were hardly crazed lunatics, and many people associate with the ritualistic slaughter of human sacrifice. Most of the cult members grew up in relatively affluent families and did not have histories of violence. Believed to be the high priestess or witch of the operation, the 24-year-old Sarah Maria Aldrete Villarreal was a tall, thin, attractive, and she was an honor student at Texas Southmost College. She was listed as College Who's Who's directory. According to one of her professors, she was a perfect student. If he had a room full of students like her, he'd be very happy. But the police never saw her darker side. She was a model, a respectful student. Little did they know that she was apparently leading a double life. And there's actually a picture of her when she spoke at a press conference. So how could apparently normal, intelligent people buy into this philosophy of a promising human sacrifice that would miraculously protect them from harm? As illogical, as immoral as it may seem, many people believe that these types of things actually do exist. Costanzo was ruled as the Hitler of his cult, just like other serial killers, if you want to call Adolf Hitler that. He was a charismatic leader, had transformed an ordinary German citizenship into brutal killers throughout the constant marches. All-day group singings of the National Socialist Party's anthem and requiring cheering. He capitalized on the promise of turning around the Germans' terrible economy and helped convince his followers of the urgency of his grand plan. So he wasn't much too different from that. There's a couple of different examples of where cults play a role in serial killers. Probably one of the more prolific ones is one that often all of us hear about with the Manson family. Charles Manson was able to convince people to kill for him as well. The reading also talks about another individual by the name of Jeffrey Lundgren, who was determined to do God's work, or so he professed, having broken away from the branch of Mormonism. Um, Lundgren was convinced that God sent him messages directly, and it was a sacred duty to carry out God's will, no matter how distasteful or violent. God's commandments transcended human laws. As armies of Satans would come, Lundgren had preached, he and his followers had to live a life off the land until Christ returned. There would be no electricity or no shelter. He would have to protect their temple by whatever means possible. So he was another example of a cult leader. What's the appeal of dangerous cults? Why do seemingly normal people tend to fall into these cults? It could be an individual who could be a failure at their everyday life and feels unappreciated by their own family or their own peers. In today's world, millions of Americans feel powerless to determine their own fate. Instead, they feel manipulated by big businesses, big government, the media, and they feel controlled by such ubiquitous threats of nuclear war, global warming, earthquakes, and international terrorism. And Messiah, whoever that might be, has all the answers and only demands loyalty. So it could be appealing to people. And these people that follow these cults are people who are valedictorians, prom queens, doctors, lawyers have all been known to join cults. There's examples of suicide or homicide. One example that the book talks about that's really well known is what hundreds of people did in Jonestown. Excuse me. I apologize. In 1978, where James Jones was able to convince several followers to drink a poisonous concoction where they all committed suicide. In 1997, just north of San Diego, 39 members of Heaven's Gate took poison and asphyxiated themselves with plastic bags over their head to ascend to the next level. David Koresh is another example, and there's countless examples of David Koresh on the internet, whether it be through movies or documentaries or whatever, where in 1993 the world watched on television as more than 80 members of Koresh's Branch Davidian, including 24 children, perished in flames at their war compound in Waco, Texas. For weeks they knew that their doomsday was near, they just didn't know how or when it would happen. In any event, they were prepared to follow the Koresh Son of God external salvations. And the chapter talks about how the agents from the ATF were able to how they raided the compound and how Koresh had been, they discovered how Koresh had been stockpiling weapons for these apocalyptic shutdowns. The book talks about, the chapter also talks about Satanism and serial murder. Cults can be around any theme. Some experts suggested that satanic cult activity is expanding in the United States and that countless unsolved murders are actually doing are attributed to satanic cults. David Berkowitz, the infamous son of Sam, confessed to killing 6 innocent people and wounding 7 others as they parked in this parked cars. It's widely believed that Berkowitz killed in response to demonic messages that he received. Berkowitz actually communicated a lot of times with the media about his satanic beliefs. The book just talks about other serial killers who follow either satanic beliefs or are part of cults. So that's chapter 11. Chapter 12 concludes the subject of serial killers on how serial killers are caught. The book talks about a 27-year-old individual by the name of Kendall Francois, who was an out-of-work school custodian who lived with his parents and younger sister in a quiet, tree-lined community in New York, upstate New York. His ramshackle greenhouse was located on Fulton Avenue, just a stone's throw from the ivy-draped halls of Vassar College, which is 2 blocks away from the sleazy main street where prostitutes regularly piled where they practice their trade. The local police received a tip about a prostitute who just claimed they were attacked by him. And while they were seated in the car, and Francois, who was fairly well known in those who worked the streets, had attempted to strangle the woman, but she somehow escaped. After interviewing the surviving victim, police arrested Francois and soon learned that he had committed more than just a single assault based upon statements that he made while being interrogated. He was charged with 8 murders and committed over a 2-year period in 1996. So that's just an example of how he ended up getting caught. Serial killers are pretty good at avoiding arrest. Sometimes their exploits go on for years, or in some cases even decades. A criminologist by the name of Kenna Quintet from Indiana University, Purdue, suggests that as many as 1/3 of the repeat killers have included prostitutes among their prey, simply because they're not as high profile, and it's easier to not be able to find one of those as it would be a high profile type of individual. According to her analysis, between 1970 and 2009, 22% of serial killers had targeted either male or female prostitutes. So the book talks about some of the killers who preyed on prostitutes and how they may have been apprehended. Again, we hear about Gary Ridgway, who was a Washington State killer known as the Green River Killer, and his exploits. And I actually remember the Green River Killer because I actually lived in the Northwest during this time, and his crimes went on for years and years and years. And he was actually even questioned about the crimes and was released. He was released for a period of time. At one point, he ended up giving DNA evidence that was later used 15 years later to get him convicted of the crime many, many years later. So yeah, his crimes went on for many, many, many years. He killed prostitutes up and down the Green River, if you will. He claims that he picked prostitutes because he hates most prostitutes and didn't want to have to pay for sex. So the chapter does talk a lot about catching serial killers. Sometimes it's just luck the way people catch these killers. Sometimes with the more about the DNA has becoming more and more prevalent, that serial killers are killers in general are being caught more easily. Serial killers will do everything they can do to avoid getting caught. A lot of serial killers have above average intelligence. They're very clever and they're very careful. As their murders go along, they tend to get better at it, if that's such a thing, better at hiding the evidence, hiding the bodies. It goes back to as far as John Wayne Gacy, who ended up hiding the bodies under his house because if you can't find the victim, typically you can't say that person was murdered. Murders committed by serial killers, especially the methodical ones, are more difficult to solve because there's a lot of times there's no motive. If you kill your spouse, there could be a motive attached to it, like for money or revenge or stuff like that. But a lot of times serial killers pick their victims at random, and because there's no real motive, that you can't really attach someone to that person. A lot of times we see in a lot of TV shows, especially shows like Criminal Minds now, FBI is using what they call profiling to find killers. Well, DNA is still probably the most understood and the most scientific or concrete way of catching somebody. But one of the more widely well-known ways of catching a serial killer, but still not fully understood, is using not racial profiling, just profiling in general, psychological profiling. And we see a lot of these profilings. Not only do we see it in shows like Criminal Minds, but we're seeing things on docu-dramas on Manhunter, I think it's called. Where is it, Manhunter? What the hell is it called? It's a it's a docudrama on how Mindhunter. I'm sorry, not Manhunter. Mindhunter on Netflix about to actually use some of the serial killers and have these actors playing the roles of these profilers, and how they would use profiling to solve these types of crimes. Profiles of serial killers are not on as a target as we would have them to be, as we see on TV. While they are valuable, a lot of times they're not very accurate. And some people believe it as, call it a pseudoscience type of thing. The research on the validity of profiling is mixed at best. Experts only agree that profilers write longer and more detailed descriptions of suspects than do the average person. So the section on profiling is kind of, there's another section on what they call VICAP. VICAP is a database where people can put in the information on unsolved crimes, and they can like match it to other unsolved crimes, and kind of help things out. It was created in 1985, and it stands for Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And it's designed to flag similarities in unsolved homicides around the country that otherwise might not get connected. So if a person commits a crime in one part of the country and commits another crime in another part of the country, in theory, they can match these two things together and put them together. A lot of times there's a lot of problems with this because a lot of agencies didn't want to share information, but that's changed in recent times, where more agencies are submitting things there. We talked about DNA. DNA is probably the biggest single greatest advance in law enforcement identifying not just serial killers, but killers in general, people with sex crimes, etc. So it's probably the biggest tool that prosecutors and law enforcement are using to this day to solve crimes. And then, of course, a lot of times, more times than not, it's one of the ways that people catch, or law enforcement catches serial killers, is just through dumb luck or lucky breaks. The killer becomes lazy, becomes complacent, sloppy, starts cutting corners, and which ultimately leads to their demise. And the book concludes by talking about a couple of serial killers who actually were caught that way as well. So that's the reading material for this week. It's a little bit longer than normal, but it's very valuable nonetheless. There is an extra reading assignment on an individual by the name of Jeffrey Lundgren, who was convicted of murdering his Missouri family. He ended up getting the death penalty in Ohio. He was originally from Missouri and claimed to be a prophet of God and killed the Avery family of 5. He claimed he was killing was a sacrifice demanded by a higher power. So he's a good example of somebody who, this kind of ties into both subjects for this week, as a satanic person who also ended up being caught by law enforcement as well. So it kind of touches on both topics for this week. Your discussion questions for this week are 4 of them. What attracts people to cults? What are some of the reasons that people might join a cult? In page 147 of your textbooks, it says, quote, not only will cult members starve themselves if instructed to do so, but they've also been known to take poison. Tell me why people will take such actions when they belong to a cult. In other words, nobody thinks it's a good idea to take poison. So I don't think anybody in this class would say that. But so why would some seemingly high-profile individuals take poison just because a cult leader told them to do so? One of the questions is to discuss the idea of FBI profiling, and I want you to write it from a scholarly point of view, not from television. Don't tell me what you hear about on Criminal Minds or Law and Order or Mindhunter. Tell me how it really exists in the real world. And then the last question has to do with VICAP and discuss the pros and cons of using such a system to catch serial killers. And if you do use references for any of these types of things or any of these for any of these questions, make sure you cite your sources. So again, your response to the discussion question is due by Thursday of this week, and response to your classmates is due by Saturday Again, responses to classmates and the questions needs to be done in a meaningful manner. You shouldn't be just saying, hey, good point, I didn't think of that. Say why you didn't think of that, why it's a good point, etc. So you need to do that to get full credit for this. And so your assignment for this week is your second quiz. So let's review what is on the quiz this week so you know what to talk about it. Early on in the serial killer section, we talked about what constitutes a serial killer or a serial murder and how many it takes. Could involve a string of 4 or more homicides committed by one or a few perpetrators that spans for days, weeks, months, or years. We talked about what the golden age of serial killers was. Make sure you know what that is. Talk about some of the characteristics of serial killers. What a sexual sadist is. You should know what that is. Who some of the victims are. We talked about the victimology are. Talked about people who kill in partnerships or teams. Talk about how we blame people, not necessarily the offender, but we blame the perpetrator sometimes. So make sure we talk about that. I like to call these the philias, the paraphilias. So make sure that you know what some of the paraphilias are. More specifically, what necrophilia is and voyeurophilia is. We talked about how pornography plays a role in serial killers. So make sure you know what that is. We talk about how the media tends to blame. We talk about what the media does as far as normalizing the crime does. For what I mean by that is how movies are made about it and stuff like that. We talk about serial killers and how they keep souvenirs, so make sure you know about that. We talked about some of the researchers and what they think about serial killers. We talked about the theory that talks about mother hate, so make sure you know about that. We talked about animal abuse, make sure you know how that plays a role. Talked about sexually motivated killers. You wrote an assignment on that, and how some are and some aren't sexually motivated. We talked about the Munchausen syndrome, so make sure you know what that is. Again, one of your discussion questions was on that. Talked this week about cults, so make sure you know what cults are. We talked about Satanism when it comes to cults. We talked about how people get caught. And then we also talked about some of the different ways that people end up getting caught, about the profiling. So that is what you should know for the quiz this week. So make sure if you have any questions about anything, make sure you let me know. And of course, so that your quiz is due by Friday of this week. So your discussion questions are due by Thursday. Your quiz is due by Friday, and the response to your classmates in the discussion questions is due by Saturday. So that wraps up module 8. After this module, we are halfway done with the class. It's hard to believe we are that far along already. Also, I forgot to mention, you also have 3 videos you should watch. One is on a serial killer that I talked about that killed people in Mexico along the Mexico-U.S. border, the cult leader named Adolfo Constanzo, so make sure you read about him. There's another serial killer, his name I talked about also, Kendall Francois, who the serial killer that was from New York, killed 8 women between 1996 and 1998. And then also there's another serial killer that we didn't really talk about. His name is Altimo Sanchez, known as a bike path killer. It's a documentary that tells about him and his wrongful conviction. There's also a documentary on David Berkowitz as well. That's 2 hours long. It's 2 hours long, but I think it's kind of interesting if you could play it in the background. It would probably be interesting to you, maybe while you're taking the quiz or you're doing some research. So that is what Module 8 is about. After this week, obviously after Module 8 follows Module 9, but before Module 9 is your spring break. So next week there is no class, there's no material due. Enjoy your time off. If you're someone who has some time to yourself, and you want to work ahead, you can certainly do that. I would suggest you take some time to do some research on your serial killer research project, which is going to be due in week 15. It's actually due on May 3rd in week 15. So make sure that you have started on that if you haven't done so already. When you come back from spring break in Module 9, we're going to be turning our attention. We're going to be moving away from serial killers and talking about mass murders, and we're talking about how some of the facts surrounding mass murders. So that wraps up Module 8's material. I hope you all enjoy the material, and once you're all done with your quiz, I hope you enjoy some well-deserved time off. Enjoy your spring break. If anyone's doing anything fun, go ahead and post it down below in the comment section. It'd be kind of interesting to hear what you're going to be doing for spring break. I'll probably just be catching up on some of these videos, some of the material I may have missed. I have 2 other classes I'm teaching, so I'll probably be catching up on some of the grading as well. So again, I hope you all have a good week. Enjoy your spring break, and I will see you in Module 9. I will see you when you come back from spring break, which is on Monday, March 18th. I won't actually see you, but you'll see me in these videos if you're watching them. Hopefully everyone's watching them. So I hope you're enjoying the videos. If you're not, let me know what I can do to improve them. I'm doing my best. When I first started creating these videos, I would create a script, but then I felt like I was just reading to the classroom. I could just post whatever that was, and you guys could read it yourself. So what I'm doing instead is I'm just kind of reviewing the chapters as I'm talking to you guys, and trying to hit the highlights of the important stuff. So if I'm stumbling over my words or it feels like I'm rushing through these, I do apologize. Just give me any feedback that you think of ways I could improve on these videos, or if you're not finding them valuable at all, I can always stop doing them. But hopefully at least 1 or 2 of you are finding them valuable. So that's it for Module 8. I will see you in Module 9. Good luck and enjoy your spring break.